Hey, I'm Mike, and I am so excited to show you the Strike API. I built a front end for it, and I think it's so much fun. You can integrate payments literally into any React app that you want. I mean, any app, but like I'm using React. I'm going to show you how it works or what I did, and then I'll kind of work my way down in complexity, starting off with like high level, and then we'll go all the way down to literally building it every step. But for right now, let's just play with it. So this is a front end that I made in React, Node React app. And first I'm going to search for my friend, Tony. He chose the name Kobe Bryant because he's Tony. And so I get account info. And then now I can see that he can receive US dollars. So I'm going to send him 1 penny. I'm going to say video, and I'm going to create an invoice. And now I have, as we see, an invoice that will expire in 1:50, and I'm going to pull up my Strike app. But you could use any Lightning app. That's what's so cool about this. I'm just going to pay with Strike. But you could use any Lightning app. Only Strike users can receive, but anyone can pay. So I'm literally going to scan the QR code. So I'm going to scan it, and then I'm going to hit confirm. Paid. Isn't that so cool? That is so cool. And I'm thinking about all the things that you can do with this. Like, I think that the simple thing that people are talking about easily integrating into any app is like any kind of tipping. But, you can make a paywall. You can anything where there's payments involved. It's kind of like at this point, why would I not use this API? I'm also thinking a really cool thing is that you can use this to bootstrap your Lightning app. So like for myself, for instance, I don't know yet how to connect a node to an app that I could make. I don't know how I could create an invoice for someone else trustlessly. But in the meantime, while I'm learning that, or until I figure that out, or someone makes it like really easy and spoon feeds it to me, in the meantime, I have this API, Strike's API, where I could literally build that, where yes, they have to be a Strike user to receive. It's custodial, this is third party, this is you're being surveilled, whatever. At this point, like you just have to be okay with that to use this, as you know. But before I can, while I'm still learning how to actually do this trustlessly, I could use the Strike API to like bootstrap my app. So I think there's like a world of possibilities that you can build with this. You can make a point of sale where this front end, like I could have put in that I'm buying a banana from Tony, and then I would have paid him. And you can build a whole UI around that, and people can you can just have an open source point of sale basically. Well, they need their own Strike bearer token if you wanted to make it totally open source. But anyway, there's just so many possibilities. I want to think about what kind of app I'd want to build where people can pay each other. So let's get into it. You saw the basic payment flow. Let's actually look at like kind of what behind the scenes what's happening. So I did make an ugly quick flow diagram, where you've got the user, the client, the node server, and then Strike API. And so the first thing is the user is going to search for a Strike account by username. You saw me do that. I typed in my friend's username, Kobe Bryant. And then the client requests account info from the node server. And then my node server requests the account info from the Strike API. Now, why am I doing this two-step process between the client and the node server? Well, that's because I could call the Strike API directly from my client, but I literally don't know how to keep my API keys secret in the client. The only way I know how to do that, to keep my API keys secret from being in the actual build file, is to have a node server running. So this is really the only purpose of the node server is for keeping our API keys secret. And maybe with the webhooks that we'll get to. I'm not sure I could actually do a webhook on the client. I don't actually know. So anyways, the client will ask our node server, hey, can you call the API, the Strike API, to get account info? So the Strike API will then return the user details, and that lets us know that Tony can receive US dollars. So now we know Tony can receive US dollars. So our node server tells the client, hey, he can receive US dollars. The client displays it to the user. He can receive US dollars. We've also decided I've also decided that at that moment we have an invoice generation form. So now the user will create an invoice. So you saw I typed in 1 penny and I typed in video for the comment. Now the client takes those invoice details. It knows that someone out there, it doesn't know who. It just knows it's going to create an invoice for Tony to receive 1 penny. And so then my client tells that to the node server. The node server calls the Strike API to generate an invoice. The Strike API sends us back it creates an invoice and then a quote, and the quote expires. But that quote is what gives us the Lightning invoice number, and that Lightning invoice number is what anyone can pay on the Lightning Network. That's what's so cool. So then we generate a QR code with that Lightning invoice number, and the client generates the QR code and then displays it. Then the user, like you saw me, I scanned that QR code with my phone, and what happens then is that the client at this point doesn't know that that invoice has been paid, but Strike knows that invoice has been paid. So what Strike does is there's one step that you haven't seen, and that's where I have subscribed through Strike. I've done an API call where I have subscribed one of my a local URL to receive Strike's webhooks. So now what Strike does is now that I've subscribed to their webhooks, whenever an invoice happens under my bearer token, whenever an invoice is changed, they will send a webhook, and a webhook is like a reverse API. So they're pinging me, and they're saying, hey, let's go check out this invoice, something changed. So then our node server gets that ping from Strike saying, hey, something changed with your invoice. So then I request details about that invoice from Strike, and Strike returns the invoice details, and they say, yeah, it's been paid. Then the node server can push via WebSocket directly to the client, and the client can display that that invoice was successfully paid. And so now you can see the whole payment flow and everything that happened on the back end, from me searching my friend to scanning the QR code. Strike knows it got paid, Strike tells us it got paid, and then we can display successful payment on the screen. And there's just like so many things you could do with that. You know, anytime there's so many ideas, I can't even get them all out. But this was the first step, is just building something to play with the API and get a solid payment flow. So we've gone over everything. Now I will do the thing that I do where I do every single step. I'm going to build this in front of you, every single step. Feel free to just go directly to my GitHub if you want to check it out. Go to Mike C/Strike API. Okay, and I've got the thing, and you can just download it and run it. But I do have like my development notes in the README, so I'm actually going to follow these notes right now. So again, if you don't want to follow along the video, just go to the GitHub and start playing along with it. I will give credit to several tutorials that helped me build this. And without further ado, every single step, let's go. First thing, what do we do to build our Strike API app? We need to get into our console. So let's get a console window open. I'm opening a console window, and I'm making sure I'm not showing you my bearer token. Nope, no bearer token displayed. Okay, so let's go, let's get out of my app. All right, React testing. Let's do, we're gonna create a new directory. Strike video, cd strike video. Okay, nothing in there. So first step on my README is we need to do npm init y. Okay, great. Now we need to alter the package, the JSON. Oops. Ignore the man behind the curtain. Let's get out of here. Strike video, package.json. What we're going to do to the package JSON is this is going to help. This is like some boilerplate. Sorry for this part, but it's just going to be necessary. It's going to help everything be so much easier. So scripts. We need to do a start script because this isn't your regular, we're going to say node server because we have to get it ready to have the node server. Okay, and then let's have a build script. And we're going to have it go automatically into the client. We're going to have a client nested within a server folder. Oh, no, sorry. They're going to have a client and a server in the same folder. And npm install and npm run build. Okay, and then we need engines. Node. And I'm just going to put my node version here. Replace with your version. Okay, what did I feel like I screwed something up really bad here. Why did I do that? I definitely didn't need that. Okay, that's what I screwed up. Okay, save that. So that's our package JSON. Let's get rid of this. So we just set up a start script so that when we hit npm start, it actually will run the server file that we're going to have called index.js. Normally, when you do just like a static front end, you'd hit npm start, and it would just fire up the like your front end. But we're actually going to, instead of firing up the front end, we're going to fire up the node server file called index.js, which will be listening at port, our localhost port. And when we go to our localhost port in our browser, it'll serve up the front end. And so yeah, so we'll have the front end and the server all running at the same time, and the server file will be basically like handling our routing, but we're not using router. Okay, so now, all right, we're in the Strike Video app. We've got our package.json. Now we are going to create our front end folder, and we're doing the create React app. We're going to call it client. I'm going to let that run. Okay, now that we've created our client, we're going to do cd client, go into that folder, and now we are going to remove the Git that it puts in there for us, because if you're going to use Git, you're going to use it at the root directory. So now let's back out of the client. So you can see now we've got a client folder, which is our create React app, and then we will also build a server folder that'll hold our index.js. So that's enough boilerplate for now. Now let's get into the client. So let's go to our app. I'm going to go to my Finder. We've got our client here. And let's go to source. And let's open up app.js. No, RStudio. I always do that. I'm going to use Sublime Text. Okay. Get rid of all this classic stuff. Also, go to the GitHub, grab my CSS file, and just plop it in, because I'm not going to go over all the CSS details, and it's going to help the app look better. If you have some, you don't have to, but I'm not going to go over it. So just copy my CSS basically and put it into the app.css. So I'm just going to do that right now. I'm going to open the CSS so you have it. We're going to go Sublime Text. I'm going to overwrite it with the contents of my CSS. Override, save, get rid of it. That's all the CSS we're ever going to do, unless you request it. If you really want to see and have my CSS explained, please ask. Otherwise, I don't know. I don't feel like it's worth it, I guess. I don't know. All right, so what do we want first thing is we want to get the whole get the client info, right? We want to search client info, search for the client. So class app name. Let's get rid of all this stuff. So first thing we're going to do, let's put a little header in here. We're going to call it Strike API. Okay, then we are going to get the account. I'm going to make a module for get account. And the thing is I'm going to have the app be like the quarterback. The app.js file be like the quarterback. So my get account module, we're going to create a module and we're going to say, so let's say get account, import get account from get account.js. The get account is going to handle our server call, handle the API call of getting the username info and then returning it to the app. And so we're going to have a little function here where we're going to do prop passing. So I'm going to say pass up user info, and then I'll have a accept user info function in this app. Because the app is the quarterback, app.js is the quarterback, get info is going to go grab it and it's going to return it. And how it's going to do that is this pass up user info will be a function within get account. And so what we will have is const accept user info. It'll take user info as an argument, and then we will do something with that. We will have a user info variable in here. So let's import something from React. Let's do our standard React import statement. So we're going to use the use state. So we're going to say const user info and then set user info equals use state. It's going to be empty when we start. So then once our get account calls, gets the account info, it's going to pass it up, and here once it receives it in app.js, we will set user info to the user info that was passed up. And then now in another module or another component, we can do something with this user info, and that's how we will create the invoice for my friend Tony or anyone else that we want to create an invoice for. But I've been paying Tony lots of pennies, so we'll keep paying Tony lots of pennies. Okay, so now the thing is that we want to do, and we'll also display this, we'll say console.log info. Sorry if my computer sounds like it's an airplane taking off. So now get account. What are we going to do with get account? Let's create it. Let's create that. No, sorry, I haven't bought the license. Let's go new file. Actually, let's do open recent. Oh, no, I didn't. Okay, let's go open. No, sorry. Sorry, new file. I had Boilerplate saved so that I didn't have to do every single freaking step. We're going to pause here, and I'm going to create all of my components. I'm going to do the boilerplate for the components so that you don't have to watch me do it. I did a little boilerplate without you, but you're going to be happy that I left you to not do it with you. All right, so I created a couple empty shell components. One is called getAccount. You see, just empty. I did import Axios, which is what we'll be using to do our API call, or talk to the server. We're going to have a display account component, a create invoice component, and then a QR card component to show the QR code. So kind of self-explanatory, I hope, but we'll work through them. And again, just empty components, just the boilerplate, so you don't have to watch me do it. And you can see here, it's just in the client source. I should create a component folder But there's just so few of them, I did not do it. My apologies, React gods. So what are we going to do in the get account? Well, we want to have a form. So let's have a form. On submit, we will do get account info. This will be a function we will create. Get account info. And then within the form, let's have like our actual form. So let's go div class name. I just happen to have called this invoice details because I use that class for another thing. This is just a CSS thing. We're just making a div and giving it a name. Within that div, we're going to have a label, and the label will be username surrounded by P tags. And then still within the label, we are going to have our input, and this will be input type text. And then the name will be handle input. Handle as in like user handle. And then let's end our label. And then outside of that, we are going to have, still within the form though, let's end the form, and let's put a submit button. So we're going to do input type submit, and then we will give it a value. We will say get account info, and we will call it the submit button. Let's give it a capital B on that button. Okay, and then I am going to drop in right outside the form. No, let's not do that. Never mind. I was going to put an error thing, but who cares? Let's not do that. Okay, so this is the JSX. Now, when we hit the submit button, as you remember seeing in the app, if it's still up, this get account info button. When we hit that, what's it going to do? Let's tell it what to do. So within our get account, let's create a function. Let's call it get account info. I'm going to splash a bunch of stuff on the screen really quick because this, you don't need to see me type out everything. So all of that I just splashed on right here. This is our get account info function. And I'll walk through what it does. We are going to send our user handle to the server because again, we've got our input type text. That is our, right here, this text input. We're going to take that handle, send it to the server. The servers are going to request the account info, and then it's going to return the results to us. And so what we've got here is prevent default. This prevents the page from reloading. That's all it does. We're going to have a data object. JSON stringify handle. This is what we're telling it. The handle is target handle input value. Target handle input value. That's the event target handle input value. Handle input, that is our input text. So that will be the text Kobe Bryant. Our config, this is for the API call. We're doing a post method. Our URL within our server app is going to be /API/getAccount. So we're posting this, we're going to post this payload to our API get account in our server file that we will create. Headers, this is just standard API stuff, and then data. So this config is all of the data for our API call. And then we're going to call Axios config. So one thing we didn't do is we didn't install Axios yet, so we will have to do that before this will work. npm install Axios. And then we've got a then. So we're going to do Axios config. Then we're going to wait for the response. So, because it's going to take a bit. It's going to take a few seconds for all of this for our server file to call Strike API, get the response from Strike API. So then we'll handle the response, and we'll say if the response is not an error, then we're going to set the user info to the data on the response object. And then we're also going to pass up this props pass up user info. This is in our app, this pass up user info. This is where we'll send our user info to. And then we got some error handling stuff here, set error false, set user info to false if there's an error, set user error, user not found, and then we've got some catch error stuff down here, console log the error. But that's, just hopefully we don't have any errors ever. Hopefully the thing never has an error. So we need two things. We need an error variable and a set user info variable. So we've got our use state up here. So that means we can do const user info and set user info equals use state. Let's go false because we're going to use the fact that there is a current user as a render thing, or at least I thought about doing that at one point, and then maybe I didn't. So we're going to go error set error use state. Let's go false on that. There's no error. Okay, so that is our whole get account. So we end up getting the information, passing it back up to app.js. So now app.js will have the user info. We'll console log it. We'll set it to our user object, user info variable. Now let's build our server file so that we can actually do this call. So now what we're going to do is let's go to our Finder, and we'll go to our terminal. And let's see, we are at the root folder, so we will do make directory server. Now we've got our server. So then let's create a new file, and we're going to name this. We're going to save as. We're going to save this in our Strike Video server as index.js. Now we're at the server. Okay, we're at the server of our app. We want to get account info from our server. Our server is going to make the API call, return it back to the client. A little more boilerplate here. Just hold on. Just hold on. All right, we've got Express. That's our server. We're going to use path. We're going to use body parser. That's just for going through the results. .env. This is to keep our API secret. I'll show you that. HTTP. Socket.io. This is going to be for talking directly to the client. Axios for making API calls. So we're going to declare a port. And that's going to be wherever you're running, whatever the defined port is, or 3001. And that's how you have your localhost 3001. It's because we've defined it here. So it's going to listen at 3001. We're going to initiate our app Express. We're going to call a server, http.createServer with that app. We are doing some I/O with this WebSocket, socket.io stuff. We'll get to that. That's going to be for talking directly to the client. But you don't have to worry about it right now. We are going to throw in this little app.use bodyparser.json. This is to help with reading the webhook posts that will come to us from Strike's API. We'll see how that works later. Another little bit of boilerplate, but this is going to be good right here. This part. This is going to be good. So have nodes serve the files for our built React app. So app.use express static path resolve directory name client build. So what we're going to do is before we run the app on our local machine, we're going to call the build script. So it's going to basically build the front end for us, and then our app can reference that built front end. So the front end's like basically totally static and built. Okay, now what we're here for, get account. We want to get the account. So I'm going to throw, I'm not going to type it all out, just drop it in. But this is what I just dropped in, get account. So remember, we were making a post call to API get account. So this is how cool it is. We're just saying app.post. So remember, in get account, we're doing a post to API/get account. So that's this, API/get account. We've got the request and the result. So we're basically recreating the, we're using that info that we passed in, the content type, the accept, the user handle. We're using that information to now create another config object for us to, again, call to the actual Strike API. One big difference here, the whole reason we're using this like two-layered thing, client and server, to do this API call is because here I can do my authorization and I don't have to type out my API key here. I can keep my API secret in a .environment file. This is the whole point, is that my API secret is in my server environment. It's never in the build file. So there's no way that someone could search my build file and get my API key out of it. And so we've got here the URL. This is the important bit too, though, is we're actually calling Strike's API. We're saying API.strike v1 accounts handle. This here is this will say in text Kobe Bryant /profile. And then it's gonna return his profile information. And so that's how we've got Axios. We're gonna call Axios config. Then, so we're gonna wait for the response, and then we will do res response.json response.data. So we're just gonna we're gonna take whatever gets responded to us from Strike's API and just flip it right back to the client. That's what this response res.json does. Little error handling down here, but this is the meat of it. We're returning that response from Strike API to our client. And that's how our client will get passed up this response, and we'll be able to set the user info and pass it back up to the app.js. So now we've got the user info at our quarterback of our whole app. So backend index.js. So in order for me to actually make this API call, I need to do a little bit more boilerplate and actually get this process.environment Strike API key. So what am I doing here? How am I going to keep my API key secret? So I'm going to create a .environment file. Oh, I also, okay, so we're going to go to our terminal. We've got our client, our server. I need to create a gitignore file. So we need to do, because we don't want to, if we upload this to Git, we don't want our .environment file showing up on GitHub. That's the whole, defeats the whole purpose. So we go File, New File, and we're gonna say here, we're gonna go just .env. That's it. That's the only thing that goes in this file. And we're gonna do Save As. We're gonna save it at the root. So Strike Video is our root. And we are going to save it as .gitignore, if I can spell that, .gitignore. Save that. Yeah. Use the dot. Okay, so that's our gitignore .environment. So now Git will ignore any .environment files. Now we can create a new file, and we can call this one save as. Save it in our, again, we're actually going to go to the root, so Strike Video with both our client and server in there. And now we're going to call this .env. So this is our environment file. So save .env, yes, use the dot. Now we've got our .env. Now I can do Strike API key equals my super secret API key. Then your index will reference this, and it will find it. And that's how it'll say process.environment Strike API key, and that's how I can do the API call. So I'm actually going to take this off screen, put my actual API key in here, save it, and then we will never see it again. So say goodbye to the .environment file. Okay, I have saved my .environment file. We never have to look at it again unless for some reason my API key changes. And now let's actually run this. This should work. Maybe not. Will it? This will not work yet. One more thing to add. Okay, what we need to do, I'm just going to add this at the bottom. app.get. So all GET requests are going to go to our built. So basically, when we go to localhost 3001, it's going to serve up response. It's going to serve up our built front end, index.html. So now we can say that. Now we can actually see our front end for the first time. So let's open up let's go back to our terminal. We are in the root, so now we can do npm run build and then npm start. That will build the front end, and then it'll start our index file, and then we can go check out the front end. I've made an error, so let's go correct our error. Something, it's saying I screwed up the package.json. Not surprised. Not surprised at all. So let's go to our video, strike video, package.json. I need to, oh, it is default. Okay, good. All right, what did we screw up here? It must be my comments. Okay, so let's get rid of, I'm gonna get rid of the comments. I think that's honestly the problem. I had engines with a capital E, put that to a lowercase, got rid of my comments, save it, say goodbye to package.json, hopefully. Go back to our terminal, run, build, start. I've led you astray. We have not installed our required packages. So we're gonna install a bunch of packages all at once. So I'm gonna do at the root folder, npm install Axios. Gosh, what else? We're using a lot of things. So let's go. We're using Axios. We're using Express. We're using Path. I don't actually know if that's a thing we have to install. I don't even know if we need body parser. But, or HTTP. I do know that we need socket IO. And then we're going to use React QR code. Okay. Okay, we installed a bunch of packages. Axios, Express, socket IO, React QR code. Now we should be able to build. Can't find module.env, so let's do npm install.env. Now let's run and build. I'm so sorry, we skipped a step. Index.js, the server file. We need to do this. We never actually started listening at our port. So we need to call server.listen port. And then it'll say console dog server listening on port, and that should say 3001. Okay, now we should be able to build. Let's go back to our terminal, run build, and start. Okay, now our server is listening, so let's go ping it with our browser and see what comes back, right? Beautiful, this is exactly what we wanted to see. Let's search. Let's move me so we can, or let's just clear our console. Wow, can't I? There we go. It's a little slow. Okay, get account info, and we got our information back. It worked. We successfully pinged and got our account info. Now that we have our account info, we can do the next thing, because in our app.js, we now have the user info. So now, what would we want to do? We probably want to build our, be able to build an invoice. We want to display the account info, and then we want to build an invoice. So let's do that next. I took a break. If you need to take a break, now's a good time. But now I'm back. So we have our user info. Now what do we want to do with that? Let's show it. Let's display it. And so that will be, just to show you, what we're going to build up to is we got the info. Now we want to show the user handle that we searched, and if they can receive, and then if they can receive a currency, we want to give a form so that we can build the actual invoice to you. So we've got our get account. We've got the user info. Now let's take that user info and put it into another component. That component will be we'll call it display account, because it'll display the information. So let's go back to our app. Let's import, let's go import display account from display account.js. Oopsies. And let's only show this. So let's say, so let's go curly bracket, user info, double and sign. That means if user info is present, if it's not null, so if we actually have received user info back, then we will render, what will we render? We will render our display account component, and we will pass in user info as the user info that we received. We're going to do a little more with display account, but let's start here. Okay, now display account, we already have it accepting props. But what do we want it to look like? We want it to render the name, the currency information. Again, it's going to be all based off of this API response. And so it's going to be the handle and then which currency they can receive, basically. So let's make another div, and we're going to call this one display account. Close the div, and what's going to go inside this div? We will have an h3 with the user handle is, and the h3, and then we'll go a new p tag, and we will call it handle. And while we're out doing that, we need to set that handle. So we do const handle set handle equal use state. It'll be blank at first. Yeah, and then I have so many divs. I put so many divs in here. We actually have this inside of another div. Okay, then let's do another div, and let's go h3 can receive. How do you spell receive? And the h3 and p we will have another can receive. Into that p tag, into that div. Okay, so we need another element. Const can receive set can receive equals use state. So again, we're going to get this from the props. We'll set these in a use effect once we have, once we know, we'll check to see if we get props populated. Okay, that's it for now. So now what we need to do is we need a use effect. Use effect. And we're not going to have it listen to anything, the use effect. Actually, we're going to have the use effect change if props change, which is, I think, probably the default behavior anyway, but I haven't noticed an issue. So if we have props.userinfo, if that is present, then we will set our handle and set can receive. So we will do set handle, and that will be props.userinfo.handle. And then we will do set can receive, props.userinfo can receive. I think that's what those are called, right? We've got handle and can receive. Perfect. Oh, you know what? Let's check. Well, if can receive is true, it should work true or false right here. Okay, so let's just render that. Let's show what it looks like. Let's go to our terminal. Let's close our terminal. Let's go run. Oh, I didn't close display account, but I'm sure you saw that. Boom. Let's go look at it. Enter username, get account. Look at that, can receive. Okay, so our can receive is blank. That is our problem. I kind of was suspecting. So let's go can receive. If it's true, oh, we're gonna pass in the string true. If it's not, we'll pass in the string false. Okay, so then that will show us the string true or false here, just like it says the string of the user handle. All right, so but we need the create an invoice. We know that we can do USD, so we need to create a US dollar invoice for Strike, so that they can send us a QR code, a Lightning QR code number. So what we're going to do then is we're going to create a, I'm going to call it currency display. I know it's not the best name, but that's just what we're going to do. Let's say I'm going to have an invoice and quote number. So let's go, if there is no invoice and quote, if we haven't made the invoice yet, so if it doesn't exist yet, then we will show the currency display. All right, now what is this currency display? Let's go into use effect. And let's say if we have user info, we are going to, let's make a currency display a variable, const currency display, set currency display equals use state. Start it off with null. If we have information, then we are going to do set currency display. All right, what will currency display be set to? We will do a mapping, because we might get multiple currencies back that are invoiceable, and we want to show an invoice for each one. So we're going to go through our response and map to every invoiceable currency. We're going to give an invoice, a currency display. So that means that we need to do props dot user info dot currencies map to each currency, call it cur. And what will we map there? We will map, first we need to check if it's invoiceable. So if cur.invoiceable, or it's called is invoiceable, again, here. Okay, so is invoiceable right here, is invoiceable true. So we'll generate a currency display for USD, but we will not generate it for Bitcoin because is invoiceable is false on the Bitcoin currency. So if it's invoiceable, then let's create a JSX element. Let's return, let's go div class name equals currency display. So this is our currency display. We need to give it a key, and we know that each of these will have, each currency will have a unique currency from the response. So we can actually use the currency. This will be the key is the USD. We put keys because into these map items because then React knows if one of the elements, everything has a unique key, and then React can check against those unique keys to see if it needs to change the DOM. So that's why everything needs to have a unique key. So now let's do a heading. Let's show the currency name. So this will say this will be the USD. Close the H3. Then let's do we're going to create invoice. We're going to create a custom component called create invoice. The create invoice will take the currency, because Strike, basically this is going to have everything that Strike needs. It will need the currency, so the currency will equal cur.currency. It will also need the user handle, so we'll pass in user handle. That will be props.userinfo.handle. It will also need pass up invoice. We are going to, when we create the invoice, again, we want to do the prop passing, and we want to receive it back to this home object. So we're going to go pass up invoice equals pass up invoice. We'll define that. Let's end our create invoice component, and then we will end our div. Okay, and that should work, hopefully. Now we need the create invoice. So let's import create invoice from create invoice. JS, save that. So what is this create invoice? This create invoice will actually have the user form. So let's go to create invoice. Okay, empty object. So the create invoice, this will be the actual component that will have the form for the user to enter how much they want to send, and like the note, the description of the invoice, and it will get back invoice details from our server, pass it up to display account, so that display account can ultimately pass it back up to our quarterback app component. Speaking of passing up, we never defined this pass up invoice function, so we need to do that. So we're going to go const pass up invoice. It will take, we're going to call this invoice and quote. We're going to say it takes invoice and quote. And it will props. So we're going to actually pass it up a couple levels. We're passing it up from the create invoice component. It's going into the display account component, where here it's going to go one level higher. It's actually going to go all the way up to the app. So this display user account is also going to have a pass up invoice and quote. And that will equal, what have we been? We've been saying accept invoice and quote. Accept invoice and quote. So pass up invoice and quote from the display account. So here we will say props.pass up invoice and quote. We will pass in the invoice and quote. So the invoice and quote is essentially it's the invoice number that we generate a QR code from. And so now we'll have that available in our app component. Accept invoice and quote, pass up invoice and quote. Yep, user info, display account. Okay, so now all the way down in the create invoice, we will have a pass up invoice function that we can throw our invoice and quote into. It'll make it all the way back up to app.js. So down here in create invoice, we want to invoice. I'm going to splash the JSX into here. So we've got a div create invoice. It's going to be form on submit get invoice. We'll have a function called get invoice. So when we press the button we'll create the invoice. Basically, our inputs are, it's going to tell us which currency we're creating, currency to send, and then we're going to have a number. This will be the amount input, and then we'll have a description. This will be the note, and then this is our submit button, where it'll call get invoice. So what is get invoice going to do? It's going to take all these details, the amount. We have the username in the props. We've got the currency, that'll be US dollars. We've got the handle, that'll be Kobe Bryant. And then it'll accept the invoice number back. And so we're gonna have amount, description, handle, and currency. So let's define get invoice. Get invoice, E, because we have a form event, so we need to do E prevent default so the page doesn't reload and we don't lose everything. Now I'm going to splash some stuff on here. This is a lot like earlier when we did our API call. We're going to send everything to our server, and our node server is actually going to do all the work. I hate the first formatting. Okay, so first thing is we've got our data. This is going to be our handle that we have from the props, our description, which is E target description value. So that's down here, this input ID. I'll show you. On here, that is, we've got the amount to send and then the description here. So that's where they entered the description, the amount, and then the currency we got passed in through props. And then we've got our config. So we are doing a post to our own API/create invoice. Remember with get account, we did API/get account. In our index.js file, we will define an app.post API/get invoice. So, or create invoice. Our headers, JSON, and then put the data in here. So now everything lives in config, and then we just call Axios config, get the response, and then do props, pass up invoice. So we're basically just getting the response and sending it right on up back to the display account component, which again here, remember, pass up invoice. Now it'll take it and it'll throw it up to pass up invoice and quote, up to the app. And here we will have the invoice and quote, which we will define accept, let's say const accept invoice and quote equals invoice and quote. We will do something with the invoice and quote here. Probably make a new variable, new use state variable. So we need to define this URL, this API.create invoice. So go to our index. Wait, did I save that? Let's save that. No, I don't want to purchase license. So now we're in the index. We need to redo this app post, but do it for creating an invoice. So let's go there. Okay, I just splashed everything you see here. I just pasted in. So this is our route. App post API create invoice. So we are going to break down what we just received, the request body. And so we've got, we're just creating all those steps again to send this like packet of information to Strike to get back from them an invoice number. And so we're just creating again the description, the amount, the currency, the amount, and we're doing off the request.body.description, request.body currency, request.body amount. We're giving it a random correlation ID, just a random number, And because every invoice needs a unique correlation ID that is arbitrary, you can pick it, but it's got to be random. It's got to be unique. And so I'm just doing a random number, but you could actually generate something based off the inputs. And then our config, it's going to be a post, and here is the strike API endpoint. And then it's invoices, handle, and then your actual handle of the user. So we're creating an invoice for the user handle. And again, application JSON, authorization, again, we're using our process environment strike API key, and then take the data, put the data into the config, and then we just do the same thing. We're doing some try and catch in case we get some response, in case we get some errors. But we're going to do invoice response await Axios config. So ideally, we're going to get a perfect response, and that will be now living in our invoice response. What we do with that invoice response is we're doing one more step before we can return the invoice and quote to the client. We need to generate a quote from the invoice number. So if we go back to the README and go to our flow, we are here, generate an invoice, then an expiring quote, and return the Lightning invoice number. So the user is requesting a new invoice and quote. And there's two steps to the API. You create an invoice. Off of that invoice, which is kind of timeless, like the invoice doesn't expire itself, you create an expiring quote. This is how you create a Lightning number, Lightning invoice number that you can create a QR code from. So it's kind of two steps. First you create the invoice, then you create the quote. That's why I keep saying invoice and quote. And so that's why we get the invoice response back, and then we need to, before we return to the client, we want to get a quote response so that we actually have an invoice and a quote number. The quote is the actual LN, the Lightning invoice number that we turn into a QR code. So now we're going to do get quote using the invoice response data invoice ID. So you create quotes from invoice IDs. And then we'll create an invoice and quote object, which will have the invoice number and the quote number. And then we will do res JSON invoice and quote, return that to the client. So that's how we can get the actual quote number to turn into the Lightning QR code. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but it's like I'm probably not doing a great job. But anyways, let's do this get quote now, because now we need to get the quote from the invoice number that we just got back. So what do? We create a get quote. And get quote is kind of simple. We're just making an API call using the invoice ID. So get quote right here. It takes, this is async. It takes the invoice ID that we just got back from the invoice response. And again, config, post, and we just can pass it right into their strike endpoint of invoices, and then you pass in the invoice ID, and then you just do /quote, and that'll just, all it needs is it just needs the invoice ID, and then it'll generate a Lightning quote for that. And again, using our strike API key. Now, we will get quote response here, await Axios config. So this will be our quote response, and then we will return quote response.data. So that gets returned right here at get quote into quote response from our, this was our create invoice endpoint. So the response will actually be the invoice and quote, which we've constructed here. Because we've got the invoice response.data, which will be the invoice, and then the quote, which is the quote response. Oh my God, it's so much. And then we return both the quote and the invoice to the client here, res.json, invoice, and quote. So we're just gonna, now we bundle it together, throw it all back up to the client. So now what does the client do with all this information? Again, the client is gonna get it at the create invoice element, which it will pass it up. Props pass up invoice, which was defined in display account. Pass up invoice was defined here, which then passes it up to its parent component. Display account's parent component is the app. So the app gets accept invoice and quote. It gets the invoice and quote. So now in the app, our quarterback component, we have the invoice and quote. So what do we want to do with this quote? We want to generate a QR code with our quote number. So we're going to say, at some point, when we get the invoice and quote, we want to render a, let's call it a QR card. And then we'll pass in the invoice and quote into the QR card for it to generate. Invoice and quote needs to be, we need to define that. So const invoice and quote, and then set invoice and quote equals use state. It'll start off with empty. And then here, when we accept the invoice and quote, that's when we will set the invoice and quote to the invoice and quote. What does the invoice and quote even look like? Well, it console logs right here, so we'll take a look. We'll run this through, make sure we're working, because then we'll get to our QR card where we actually display the QR card for the user to pay. Oh my God, we're so close. Okay, so let's go get what we want. We've got our app. Let's show it. Let's build. I did something wrong. What was it? Currency display. In the currency display, here we go. I need to not end that div. Save it. First issue is our QR card is not defined. So let's do import QR card from qrcard.js. Again, empty component, QR card. I'll get into the React QR code here. Now, what else did it have for us? Display account, invoice and quote is not defined. So display account. Invoice and quote is there, that's okay. Oh, down here, no invoice and quote. Okay, so we need to set. So when we get the invoice and quote, we need to set invoice and quote. And then we need to create our invoice and quote holder. Set invoice and quote. Okay, let's try that. Okay, we're loaded up. Let's go hit it and see what happens. Display account. Where is our... No! Where is our display account? I found le problème. It's pretty simple. It's right here, invoiceable. I spelt wrong multiple times. So, invoice ends with an E. So, is invoice able? So, invoiceable. Make sure you got that spelling right, because I foobarred it up and I spelled that wrong. Hopefully, you didn't spell that wrong. Is that the only time I have invoiceable? I think it is. Let's try it again. Okay, we are running. Let's check. My banana bread is done. Better go check the oven. Oh, we got it. Okay, so now we can create our invoice. Let's create it and see what gets returned. Let's send 1 penny. Video test. Create the invoice, and over here, excellent, we've got our, let me move me over. Getting returned back to us, we've got our invoice and quote right here. So this is like the actual invoice and quote object in create invoice. But we've got our quote number, we've got our invoice and our quote. So our invoice has the amount, that correlation ID, which is that random number we generated, the created on, the description, video test, the invoice ID, the issuer ID, which would be my Strike API key, and then the receiver ID, which would be my friend's. The state is unpaid, that's important. This invoice state is unpaid. We will check for that later. And then for the quote is where you get the conversion rate from dollars to Bitcoin, so that you can create the invoice, or the Lightning invoice. Again, it's got the same description. It's got an expiration of 117 seconds. Expiration in seconds, 117. The LN invoice. This is the actual LN invoice number that we will generate a QR code from. And then you got the source amount and the target amount. That's all Strike's stuff that it's going to handle for us. All we need is this LN invoice number. So beautiful. That will create the QR code that any invoice, any Lightning wallet can pay. So let's generate that. Oh, and the reason if you notice, when we got our invoice and quote back, our form to create an invoice disappeared. I did that on purpose, and that was done in the, let's move me over. That was done up here in app. No, it's display account. Only if you don't have an invoice or quote do you do the currency display that allows you to create an invoice. So now that we have an invoice and quote returned back, we get rid of that currency display. So it's just like per page reload, we're going to give you one shot to create an invoice. Reload the page if you want to try again, basically. And I just did that so that the page doesn't get cluttered up with all these components that we've been building up to. All right, so now finally we have our invoice and quote. We've got our QR card. Let's create the actual QR code for us to read. So our QR card component, again, if invoice and quote is present up here in app, right here, invoice and quote that we set when we received it from its child components, let's do a QR card where we pass in the invoice and quote. So now QR card, we're gonna get our stuff through the props. If you notice here, QR code from React QR code. This is a npm install React QR code. And this QR code, it basically generates a actual readable QR code, computer readable QR code from a number, any arbitrary input. And I'll show you how that works. So QR card. I'm going to throw a bunch of stuff into here, and I'll go over it. So outer div, empty, just plain div. We're going to say if not expired. What is expired? We're going to have a const expired and then set expired, because we're going to have a countdown timer. And we're going to start off with it is not expired. So it's not expired, which means we're gonna, this is the first time I'm using React fragments, but it's essentially the same thing as a div. And so I could have put a div, but I just did this. So if it's not expired, we are gonna show a QR card. This will have a title, which will be the target amount currency, so that'll say USD, and then it'll have props, invoice and quote, target amount, which will be the actual amount in USD. And so that's where it will show, like on here, how you've got this QR code right here, and it's got the currency and the amount on display. And then we'll have a div class called QR. And then here's where we use our module, our QR code module. So QR code value. The value is the arbitrary string or number that we're going to pass in that will generate the actual QR code. And so that's going to be props, invoice and quote, Lightning invoice. We'll have another div, and we will have here with another header whether or not it's paid. And so if you see here, right here it says unpaid, that is this invoice and quote invoice state. So that will either be paid or unpaid. Right now it's unpaid. End the React fragment, and then we will have a countdown timer sitting right below. So countdown timer, we have another component. Oh, I did not create the countdown timer. So the countdown timer, we will create that. We will call it countdown timer from countdowntimer.js. Save that. So the countdown timer is going to get our target date, and we're going to float up the expired notice. So we'll receive an expired notice here from the countdown timer. So the countdown timer is going to do all its counting on its own, and then when it expires, it's going to go, hey, parent component, I've expired down here, and that's where we will get it down here. We'll set an expired. So let's do this float up expired notice, receive expired notice. We need to define this function. So we're going to go const receive expired notice. Let's call it is expired. Experted is expired. And we will do set expired if it's expired. So this will come back as true when it's expired, and then our expired will become true, and then we will no longer, because it'll be expired, we'll no longer render the QR code, code card. Okay, now we need to make a target date. Couple other variables up into here. So we're going to go time in seconds is going to be our props, invoice in quote, expiration in seconds times 1,000. So this is going to be this is basically going to be 117, because if you remember in the expiration in seconds, it gives you 117. That's 117 seconds. So we're going to take that, turn it into milliseconds, and we get 117,000 milliseconds. And then we'll do now in milliseconds, which basically says get right now, this moment in time, get our time in milliseconds. And then that's how we get the target date. We basically say now plus time in seconds, so 117,000 milliseconds, gives us our target date. And we pass in that target date into our countdown timer. So then our countdown timer knows the actual exact time, 117 seconds from now. When it reaches it, it should say, I've expired. So before we do that, let's go ahead and I'll show you that you actually got a valid QR card that you can pay. You just won't get the notice that it's been paid yet because we haven't built that in. And we won't get the expiration. Actually, we need to build the countdown timer. So let's go new file. We're going to go save as client source. Call this countdowntimer.js. We are going to use a custom hook here to do the counting for us. We'll go into that. Now, I'm just going to show you the whole countdown timer component here. Boom. We've got countdown timer. We're receiving a target date. And then we're going to also float up the expired notice with our defined function. And we're going to start off with generating days, hours, minutes, and seconds. Use countdown with our target date. So use countdown as our custom component. This is basically going to return how many days, hours, minutes, and seconds until expiration. And the way use countdown is built is it's going to have an interval, so it's going to do this every second. It will re-return these values, which eventually will reach 0 for all of them when it's expired. And so then we look at this and we add up. If all the days, hours, minutes, and seconds left equals 0, then we're going to send up float expired notice to true. So we tell parent component, hey, we've expired. If not, we're going to render the days, hours, minutes, and seconds. So if you notice here, we're rendering in a show counter. Let's that's an actual counter display. It's just a kind of a dummy object or a dummy component, but I'll splash it here. So you got show counter. It's just in this same file, just like this. It's going to take in the days, hours, minutes, and seconds, just like we are putting it here. And it's just going to render days, hours, minutes, seconds in this kind of fancy way. And you got some CSS class names going on here, but no real logic in here. Okay, two more things. If you notice here, date time display. The date time display is its own, again, another little component. And date time display will take in a value, a type, and is danger. This is just some CSS stuff, if it shows red up or not. But you're going to give a value and a type. So this will be days equals 1, or minutes equals 3. One more thing, the expired notice. So you see here, return expired notice if we get hit expired. The expired notice is just another simple dummy component that will literally just say, hey, go create a new invoice, please. We got some CSS here. It says span expired. The last thing we have to build is our use countdown custom hook. So this will be what will basically be checking against the target date every second and returning how many days, hours, minutes, and seconds we are until we get there. So let's create our custom hook. Okay, first thing for our custom hook is we need to new file. We're going to save this as, we're going to do source. We're going to create a new folder. We're actually going to call it hooks. I know, I'm finally doing it, creating a folder. So create hooks, and then we will call this use countdown. All hooks have to be titled with the use first. Okay, and I'm just going to throw the whole component into here. Oh, we didn't title it useCountdown.js. Okay, save as useCountdown.js. All right, so we're using custom normal React stuff. So this, remember, this component receives the target date, and it returns back days, hours, minutes, and seconds left until expiration. And this is all just math that gets us to return the days, hours, minutes, expiration, and seconds until that target date. And here in this use effect, we do this interval, set interval, every 1,000 milliseconds, where we reset our countdown to check against now and the countdown date. So all that being said, we've got a variable, and it is the countdown date. So that's where we're creating a date from our target date. So it's just creating a date object from the target date passed in. So let's say this is tomorrow. So our countdown date is now tomorrow. And then we're going to create a countdown and a set countdown, which is use state. It's going to be our countdown date. So it's going to be tomorrow minus right now. So that would be, our countdown would be basically one full day, because tomorrow minus today would be 1 day. So now we know that the difference between the target date and now is 1 day. So then what we do is in use effect, every time this renders, every time this component is rendered, which it will because we're doing a set interval, it'll fire off every second. And we're going to call this interval, and what we're going to do is we're going to set a new countdown. And that every second, our countdown date, again, is minus right now. So every second we're reevaluating and saying, so it's going to go from 1 day to, 0 days and 99, let's go hours, whatever, like it's going to count down. And then make sure you could do this cleanup, clear interval function. And then you're going to have a return, get return values countdown. So this is this get return values. So it's 1 day, but how many, this is the part I was trying to figure out just now, is how many days, hours, minutes, and seconds does that 1 day equal? And that's where this get return values actually returns days, hours, minutes, and seconds from this 1 day value, or this half day value, or this 117 second value, which would be the actual we're passing in. Very bad explanation, I'm sorry. Export use countdown. So now we can use this use countdown in other components. So let's save this, which I think we have. So now we'll have an expiration counter. We'll get the notice. So now let's do one more check, make sure everything works. Okay, our app is running. Let's refresh. Let's go check our user. Let's create another. Let's go test for QR card. Create invoice. Boom! USD, 1 penny, unpaid. Let's go ahead and pay this really quick with Strike just to make sure it works. Oh, where's our expired notice? There's expired notice. Formatting looks totally bad, but maybe it always looked that bad. I think it always looked that bad. I just didn't even care. Opening my Strike app. Verifying my identity. Pay. Scan. Ooh. Confirm. Okay, so Strike knows it got paid. But I want to know. In my app, I want to know that I got that invoice has been paid. So, what do we do about that? Now, let's get into what does Strike do? Let's go to the flow. We just paid the invoice by scanning the QR code. So Strike then sends a webhook that the invoice has been updated. So Strike sent a webhook that the invoice has now been updated. We will then request details about the updated invoice, because all we know is Strike will say to us, it'll send a webhook to our node server. It'll say, hey, this invoice has been updated. We need to then go ask Strike the invoice status, which will then tell us, hey, it's been paid. Then we can display our successful payment message to the user. So the first thing we start with this webhook, we need to know, Strike needs to know. So we are actually going to do a Python call. You could do it in Node, but I just happen to have done it in Python, and I'll show you how it goes. Where we actually tell Strike, hey, any invoices under my API key, send your webhooks to this certain URL. So let me show you that URL. Right here, we're going to subscribe to event webhooks. So the API endpoint for Strike is this, Strike me v1 subscriptions. And this is how we subscribe to webhooks. And I'm going to create a payload where we've got, this is the important bit, my webhook URL. I have a custom URL endpoint generated by ngrok. We'll go into that. But basically, if this app was live and running, then I would just tell it the endpoint in my index.js. Oh no, I froze. How long ago did I freeze? New movie recording. Ah! Float that busy on top. Okay, so this URL right here is basically I have ngrok tunneling my local host to this URL so that Strike can ping it. But in production, I would change this to whatever, I would change this to in my index.js, I would change it to something else. Like, I would have some kind of route at the end of my URL for the site. But for right now, we use ngrok. And they just, so that I can do local development and still receive webhooks from Strike. And we'll get into that, how to do that. But webhook version v1, secret, webhook secret. You can create a secret so you can check to make sure you're getting the same, so that you're not getting faulty webhooks from someone else that's posing as Strike. Enabled true, and then we want updates when anytime an invoice has been created or updated. And then our headers, where I've got my secret API key here, and then response equals, we're gonna actually send it here, and then print the response text. But basically, this is what will allow us to get webhooks every time an invoice changes. So this, how did I do this? This is ngrok. Go download ngrok. And then I just told ngrok, I gave it a command. I downloaded ngrok from their site, and then I said, and then in my command line from just any directory, I said ngrok http 3001. And it created forwarding. It created this URL. So basically, this is a URL that is live on the internet. This is the URL that I gave to Strike, and it's forwarding that to my localhost 3001. And so that's how Strike's webhooks go actually into my localhost app. And so that's ngrok. That's how you actually get a URL from your localhost so that Strike can ping it. But what does that ping look like? So below is what the webhook post body looks like. First one is upon invoice creation. So this is what it'll look like if you've been paid. So we are going to actually get a body, a payload from Strike. And it's going to look like this. It's going to have an ID. It's going to have event type. It's going to say an invoice was updated. It's going to give us the webhook version. But the entity ID is going to be I think this is the invoice ID that was updated. And then it's going to give us the change. It's going to say changes. It's going to say a state change. So this is why we're going to get an invoice ID from Strike, and it's just going to tell us, hey, the state changed, but we're not really necessarily telling you what changed. So then we will ping Strike again for this invoice ID to actually get the actual invoice details where it should say, status paid. And that's how we'll know in our app we actually got paid. So we're set up to receive webhooks from Strike. Now we need to define our endpoint in our index.js file. So now let's go down here. So Strike's going to ping us at 3001. This server file is listening at 3001. So right here. So app post hook. So it's going to send it to hook. We've defined this hook, and I think did I show you how I did that? In here, I gave that URL that ngrok set up for us, and I did /hook. And so that's where I'm listening now. Everything, so when it gets posted to hook, I'm supposing this is my webhook from Strike. And we got a request and a response. We want to respond with a status 200 to let Strike know that we received it. And then we want to check, hey, if it's an invoice that's been created, if the request body.event type equals invoice created, then just return, get out of here. We don't care we're just listening for changes. So now we're checking, okay, if the body changes is state, then let's go get invoice status. And then we're going to do an IO emit message where we say invoice ID and status. We're going to emit this to the client. So this is a web socket down here, but this let invoice status, we need to go get this invoice status. So get invoice status is going to be another function we will define in our server file. And so get invoice status, I'll do it down here. This is where we take the invoice ID. So again, we've got our request body data entity ID. So take that invoice ID, and we're going to pass it up to Strike through this get invoice status. And ideally, from that, it'll be a valid invoice ID. Strike will tell us we'll get the details about the invoice, and from there we can check, is the status paid or not paid? What's the status? And so here we get our response, await config based on this invoice ID, and then we return the state. So the state gets passed into this invoice status object that we've defined. So then we will emit up to the client a message, and it'll say invoice ID is our invoice ID from the original webhook, and then the status of that is our invoice status based on our get invoice status API call here. So this should be invoice ID and status equals paid. And this IO emit, that is a WebSocket. A WebSocket is a direct connection between our server and the client. And so IO on, did we define IO already? I think I did. Yeah, IO equals new server. So we defined our WebSocket. Yes, we did. Okay, good. So then IO down here on connection. So our client will connect, and then we'll just do a little console logging. But really, this allows us to do this IO emit, so that any connected clients will get they'll get any. So that it gets a little muddy because any connected client, so any live client out there, anyone who's got the browser window open, they're gonna get for every invoice updated, where any status is changed on an invoice, they're going to receive an invoice ID and a status and a status. So at the client, we could do the parsing here where we filter and only send messages to certain clients, or we just let the client receive all of the updates, and then we'll have the client itself say, is this my invoice that I care about, and then display paid or not. So let's just assume our client's going to get all of them. And so in our app, we need to actually connect. So that's where we go. Do I have socket? No. I need to do import statement in app, where we do import IO from socket.io/client. And then when the app starts, we're going to do a const socket equals IO. And then let's go down here and let's say when we get a message from socket. So we need socket.on, and when we get a message, what do we do with that message? We will do set, or we will do handle socket message, and then we'll have the message. So we're going to get the message from the client, from the server. The client will get the server message from the socket via the WebSocket, and then we have this function here, handle socket message. Basically, this is going to check. It's going to take. We know our invoice number. We know the client's invoice number because we already got it. We're going to check, is this message that we're getting from the server right now, is this our invoice number? So what we do here is we say if res invoice ID equals invoice and quote invoice ID, and res status is paid, then we console log paid, baby, and then we can set paid indicator to true, set invoice and quote to null because it's all going to be kind of done now. But let's do this set paid indicator because we want to render that we've gotten paid. So we do const set paid indicator. No, first, sorry, we need to do paid indicator. Sorry, keep doing that. Paid indicator, and then set paid indicator. And we're starting off with false because it's starting off with having not been paid. And then here, when we get paid, we'll set it to true. So once we have gotten paid, that's when down here we can display that we've gotten paid. So paid indicator. So when paid indicator becomes true, we can render an H1 that says paid. Let's do a couple exclamation points. Get rid of that, finish off that H1. So now we should know that we got paid. So let's do that. Let's do the payment lifecycle and let's see, did we get paid? Give me my money. Okay, we never resolved socket.io client. We never installed that. Oopsie. Where have I been installing these? Not at the, I've been doing it in the root, right? Yeah. So let's go npm install socket.io/client. Rebuild. Okay, we are listening We are subscribed to webhooks. Let's go check this out. We're going to pay my friend. We're going to give him one more penny. We are going to say testing for paid indicator. Create the invoice. Boom, unpaid, 1 penny, scan it. Oh, look at that. Who cares about the type error? It's working. Look at that. That is it. You've now got the full payment life cycle. You can integrate payments into literally anything now. If you made it this far, I'm honestly amazed that you stuck it out with me. I thank you. I want you to let me know in the comments that you made it to the very end. And then ask me for what you want, because if you watched this whole thing, then you are truly who I made this video for, and I want to continue making videos for you. So let me know what you want. Let me know you made it to the end. I'm so incredibly impressed. Thank you. Thank you. Have a good day.